The notice had been folded so many times the crease lines had gone white. She'd kept it in the inside pocket of her coat all the way from Owen Sound, through the long rocking hours on the train, through the transfer at Sudbury, where she'd stood on the platform in the November dark and wondered, not for the first time, whether she was making a mistake. The paper was soft now from handling. She didn't need to unfold it to remember what it said. She had the words by heart the same way you remember the words of a song you didn't mean to learn. Widower, Carpenter, north of New Liskeard. One son, age 7. Looking for a capable woman to manage the household. Honest work. Fair arrangement. Honest. She'd liked that word. Most of the notices she'd read in the back pages of the paper didn't bother with honesty. They talked about opportunity and good prospects and the beauty of the northern country, as though a woman might be won over by scenery. This one had just said what it was. She was the last one off the train at Larksburg Junction. The station was small. A single room with a wood stove and a bench and a man behind a wicket who didn't look up when she came in. Through the window she could see a wagon and a gray horse standing at the rail, breath clouding in the cold. A man stood beside the wagon with his hands in his coat pockets. He was looking at the train, then at the door, then back at the train. He didn't look impatient. He looked like a man who had learned to wait. She picked up her bag and went outside. He was taller than she'd expected, though she hadn't exactly expected anything. Dark coat, work-worn at the elbows. A face that had spent a lot of time outdoors, not unpleasant, just weathered. The way wood weathers when it's good wood, when it holds. He took his hands out of his pockets when he saw her coming down the steps. "Miss Renault?" he said. "Yes," she said. That was more or less all they said for the first hour. He lifted her bag into the back of the wagon without asking if he could. She didn't mind. He held the side of the wagon while she climbed up, and then he went around and climbed up himself and clicked to the horse, and they pulled out onto the road heading north. The trees came in close on both sides. Spruce mostly, and birch with its white bark peeling back like old paint. The sky above them was the flat gray of a tin plate. She watched the roadside. He watched the road. The horse's shoes rang on the frozen ground. She had grown up knowing how to be quiet. Her mother had been a quiet woman, and her father quieter still. And the house she'd grown up in outside of Penetanguishene had been the kind of house where silence wasn't something that needed to be filled. She had not always been grateful for that. There had been years when she'd wanted noise, wanted music and argument and the sound of other people living. But those years had taught her things she hadn't wanted to learn. And now she was 29 years old, and she had come back around to quiet. The boy was at a neighbor's when they arrived. The house sat back from the road at the end of a lane that bent around a stand of birch. It was larger than she'd expected. 2 stories, well built, with a covered porch along the front and a woodpile stacked neatly along the east side. A workshop stood off to the left, closer to the road, with double doors and a low roof and shavings curled on the ground outside where the wind had carried them. He brought the wagon around to the back and unhitched the horse without any ceremony. She stood in the yard with her bag and looked at the house. The back door was unlocked. He'd left it unlocked, she supposed, because there was no one to lock it against out here. Inside, the kitchen was cold. The stove had been out since morning, but it was clean. Not a woman's clean, exactly, but a man's clean, which is a different thing. Things put away rather than properly sorted, surfaces wiped rather than scrubbed, but an honest effort at it. She could see he had tried. She set her bag by the door and found the kindling box and started a fire. He came in while she was putting the kettle on. He stopped in the doorway and looked at her as though he'd half forgotten she would be there. "The boy's at Fenwick's," he said. "I'll go get him after supper." "All right," she said. She found salt pork in the cold cellar and dried beans in the pantry and made what she could. He ate without comment, which she took as a good sign. A man who eats without comment either has no complaints or has decided that complaints aren't worth the trouble. She didn't yet know which kind he was. The boy's name was Mathieu. He was 7 years old and small for it, with his father's dark eyes and a watchful face that reminded her of a cat near a door, not hostile, just not yet sure whether to come in or go. He said hello when his father told him to, and then sat down at the table and ate his supper and looked at her from under his lashes when he thought she wasn't watching. She let him watch. She didn't perform for him. She'd seen other women do that, smile too brightly, ask too many questions, try too hard to win a child over, and she'd seen what it got them. A child couldn't be won. A child had to come of its own accord, in its own time when it was ready. She washed the dishes and he dried, or rather she washed, and he stood beside her holding the towel, occasionally rubbing at a plate and setting it on the wrong shelf. She corrected him gently, and he corrected the plate, and they did not speak. His father was in the workshop. She could hear the sound of it, a plane running along a board, then stopping, then running again. The rhythm of it was not unpleasant through the kitchen wall. She found her room at the top of the stairs. It had a narrow bed and a window that looked out toward the birch trees and a hook on the back of the door for her coat. There was a lamp on the dresser and a braided rug on the floor, round and faded, red and brown. Someone had put it there deliberately. She thought about that while she unpacked her things. The first snow came in the second week of December. She'd been there 3 weeks by then, and the shape of the days had settled into something she recognized. Up before the men, before Mathieu, she had started thinking of him as one of the men, which made him laugh the one time she said it aloud. Stove lit, breakfast made. He left for the workshop by 7 most mornings, and she didn't see him again until noon. Mathieu went to the school in town 4 days a week, the 5th day varying depending on weather and the state of the road. On the days he stayed home, he sometimes appeared in the kitchen while she was working and watched her with that same careful attention. She had begun leaving small tasks at the edge of her workspace. A handful of dried beans that needed sorting, a length of twine that wanted untangling, and sooner or later he would drift over and pick them up. He never asked to help. He just began helping, and she accepted it without comment, the same way she'd been accepted herself. She had started to understand by then that this was how it worked here. Nothing was said directly. Things were offered and accepted or not, and the not accepting was also fine, and nobody made a point of anything either way. She found it restful. The snow came overnight, and she woke to a world changed entirely. The birch trees were white-armed against a white sky. The woodpile wore a cap of it. She stood at the kitchen window in the early dark with her coffee and watched it and felt something she didn't immediately have a name for. Not happiness exactly, but the next thing adjacent to it. He came in for breakfast and looked out the window and said, "Roads will be bad for a few days." "I know," she said. He looked at her. She poured him coffee. "You're not from the city," he said. It was not quite a question. "Georgian Bay," she said. "Small town." He nodded and wrapped both hands around the mug and looked out the window again. She had learned by then that he was not a man who asked questions. Whether this was temperament or privacy or some older wound, she couldn't tell. He would answer a direct question plainly, but he didn't reach for information, didn't pry. Some women would have found it cold. She found it mostly respectful. She had also learned some things about him simply by watching. He was meticulous in his work and careless about everything else. The workshop immaculate, his own coat thrown over whatever chair was nearest. He drank 2 cups of coffee in the morning and no more. He read in the evenings or tried to. She had noticed him falling asleep over a book more than once and setting it aside with the page unmarked, which suggested he had either a good memory or a poor one. He was patient with Mathieu in a specific male way, not tender exactly, but steady, like a fence post, not embracing but something to lean against. The boy had begun to talk to her, not a great deal, not all at once. But she would come into the kitchen and find him already there, sitting at the table with his arithmetic, and he would say something about a boy at school, about a bird he'd seen, about a dream that had been strange and didn't make sense. She would listen and say something back, and he would nod and return to his arithmetic. One evening she was mending by the lamp, a tear in Mathieu's coat, long since due, when the boy came downstairs. He was supposed to be in bed. He stood in the doorway in his socks and looked at her with his father's eyes. "Is that mine?" he said. "Yes." "Did you find it?" "It was on the chair in the hall." She held it up so he could see where the lining had given way at the shoulder seam. "I'll have it done before it snows again." He was quiet for a moment. "My mother used to do that," he said. She lowered the coat. "Mend things," he said. She was good at it. She didn't say she was sorry. She'd learned that sorry was the wrong word most of the time. Not because it wasn't true, but because it put the weight in the wrong place. made the other person carry the fact of your sympathy instead of their own feeling. She said. What else was she good at? He thought about it seriously. Bread, he said, and whistling. Papa says she could whistle better than most men. That's a good thing to be able to do. Can you whistle? She put 2 fingers in her mouth and whistled one clear note, and Mathieu startled and then laughed. A real laugh, sudden and unguarded, like a window flung open. She hadn't heard him laugh like that before. Go to bed, she said. Okay, he said, still smiling. Good night. Good night. She sat for a while after he'd gone upstairs, holding the coat and listening to the house. The stove ticked. From somewhere above her, she could hear the sound of his father moving around, the creak of the floor. A drawer opened and closed, and then that sound too went quiet and the house was still. She put her needle into the cloth and kept on. The difficulty, when it came, arrived quietly. It was January, and the cold had settled in for good. The kind of cold that Northern Ontario specializes in, the kind that has no interest in being dramatic about itself, that simply is the way a stone wall simply is, blunt and without apology. She had started keeping a stone beside the stove to warm her feet in the evening, something her grandmother had done. Mathieu had looked at it with great curiosity and asked a number of questions about how it worked, which led to a longer conversation about heat and stone, and the way some things hold warmth longer than others. She had been thinking about letters. There was a woman in Owen Sound she had written to, for years. A woman named Dorothy, who had been her closest friend since they were girls. She had written to tell Dorothy where she was going, and why, and Dorothy had written back with warmth and concern, and several pointed questions about the man's character and the state of the house, and whether she knew what she was getting into. You've done this before, Dorothy had written. Gone somewhere difficult and stayed longer than you should. You're allowed to leave if it's wrong. She'd folded that letter and put it in the same pocket where she kept the notice. She read them both sometimes, back to back, because together they formed a kind of argument she found useful. The difficulty was not what she'd expected. She had expected, coming into a household like this, that the hardest thing would be the practical work, the weight of it, the repetition, the invisibility. She had done enough invisible work in her life to know its texture. But the practical work here was fine. The house was manageable, the boy was no trouble, and she'd been doing a woman's work since she was 12 years old. The hardest thing was that she had started to care whether she stayed. She had come here as a practical decision. Fair arrangement, the notice had said. She had understood that, agreed to it, come north on those terms. She had not intended for the terms to change. But somewhere between the first snowfall and the thaw that hadn't arrived yet, something had shifted, and she didn't know what to do with the shift because she didn't yet know what he intended or what she was allowed to want. It was a Wednesday evening, the last week of January, when it came to a point. Mathieu was in bed. She was at the kitchen table with her own letter writing. She owed Dorothy a reply that was 3 weeks overdue. When he came in from the workshop, this was not unusual. Sometimes he worked until 8 or 9, came in cold-handed and quiet, poured himself a glass of water, and went up to bed without a word. She had stopped being startled by it. But this time he stopped at the table and looked at what she was writing. Not reading it, she had folded the page under her arm without thinking, but looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Careful, as though he was considering something and had not yet decided. The boy talks about you, he said. She waited. He told Fenwick's wife that you can whistle. He said it without inflection, just set it down there. I told him to go to bed, she said. He showed up in the doorway. That's what he does. A pause. He didn't do that before. She looked down at the table. The letter, the lamp flame, bending a little in the draft from the door. The arrangement, he said, and stopped. She didn't help him. Not because she was unkind, but because she'd learned with some men that helping them to say a thing too easily meant they never quite finished meaning it. He tried again. I put that notice in because the house needed running and the boy needed someone here. That was what I was thinking. I know, she said. That's not what I'm thinking now. The stove ticked. Outside, somewhere, a branch gave under the weight of ice, a clean, sharp crack in the dark. She thought about Dorothy's letter. You're allowed to leave if it's wrong. She thought about Mathieu's laugh, sudden as a window opening. She thought about the braided rug someone had put in her room deliberately, round and faded, not nothing. "Neither am I," she said. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He didn't reach for her hand. He didn't say anything else right away. He just sat there, the two of them at the table in the lamplight, and she returned to her letter because the conversation was finished, and the conversation was not finished. Both at once, the way some things are. She wrote to Dorothy, "It's colder here than anywhere I've been. The boy is good company. I think I might stay." She would finish the letter tomorrow. The thaw, when it finally came in late March, arrived overnight the same way the first snow had. She went to bed in one world and woke in another. The eaves were running. The birch trees had gone soft around the edges. She stood at the kitchen window with her coffee and listened to the drip and run of water and felt the season turning under the ground like something deciding to begin. Mathieu came down early that morning, still in his socks, and stood beside her at the window. "It's warm," he said, surprised. "It'll be cold again before it's warm for good," she told him. But yes, he pressed his palm flat against the glass. She watched him feel the difference. "Are you going to plant a garden?" he asked. "I think so. If there's room." "There's room," he said. Mama had one, back behind the workshop. He considered this. It all went to weeds. "We could clear it," she said. He looked at her, you and me and your father when he has time." He pressed his hand to the glass again, nodded slowly as though approving a plan he'd had some part in. "Okay," he said. Then he went to put his boots on, and she heard him calling to the dog. A big dark-coated animal with one white ear, named Sergeant, who had been suspicious of her for weeks and had recently begun sleeping on the mat outside her bedroom door. And then the back door swung open, and boy and dog went out together into the changed morning. She drank her coffee. Later, she would go to the workshop door and knock twice, the way she'd learned to knock, and he would look up from his work, and she would say that the ground was starting to thaw, and he would nod, and she would say she was thinking of clearing the garden beds behind the building, and he would put down his tool and look at her for a moment in that way of his, and say, "I'll help after lunch." And they would work side by side in the mud and the cold, sweet smell of turned earth, the three of them. 4, if you counted Sergeant, who lay at the edge of the garden with his chin on his paws and watched them with great seriousness. And Mathieu would find a worm and announce it to the general company. And she would look over at the man working beside her and find him already looking at her, and look back at her work and feel the ground firm under her boots. She had been looking for honest work. She had found that, and something more, and she had not known that the something more was what she was missing until it stopped being missing. That was the kind of thing you couldn't have put in a notice. Some things you had to come north to find,